Let's expand the conversation now with Democratic Congressman of Florida, Jared Moskowitz. He sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. First, your reaction to the U.S. and Ukraine agreeing to terms for this 30-day interim ceasefire. How do you view this development?
Well, look, this is a little bit of good news. First, the U.S. is undoing the pause on aid, undoing the pause on information, intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which is good news. It was curious to me why we were being tougher on Canada, Ukraine, and Greenland than we were on Russia and Iran. We got confused, obviously, for a moment. So that's good news that we're undoing those pauses. I think it's also smart that Ukraine is agreeing to the ceasefire and putting the onus on Russia to do it as well. So this is a good development at the moment, and I'm glad that the president and his team had figured out that it's Ukraine that's our ally and not Russia.
Let's bring in Ian Bremmer, who's the founder and president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media, to talk about this. We also should note, Ian, that military aid and intelligence sharing, which had been paused from the U.S. to Ukraine, is now being reinstated. It sounds like as it was before. What do you make of this development, of course, with the understanding Russia has a big say here?
Well, irrespective of how the Russians respond, this has changed the dynamic. I wouldn't say this puts Zelensky back in Trump's good graces. That's an exaggeration. But it certainly means that the Ukrainians have some initiative, that they have been prepared to accept the terms as offered by the United States to stop the fighting for 30 days. And they're prepared to do that right now. And given that Trump's election campaign promise for months is, I'm going to end this war, and the American people, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you'd like to see this war over. You'd like to see the fighting stop. You'd like to see the money stop. You'd like to see the killing stop. So now Zelensky can say, I've approved that. And the Europeans can stand up for it. And I suspect they will in very short order. We haven't heard that yet, but over the coming hours, I suspect you'll see lots of Europeans saying, yes, we're in favor of this. What about Putin? And, Putin hasn't taken back all of the territory that Ukraine occupies right now in Kursk, in Russian territory. He certainly wants to do that. He has acted correctly, in my view, as if time is on his side, that he can outlast the Ukrainians. So he has much less interest in accepting these terms, certainly not by themselves. I mean, his interest in talking to Trump has been all about a broader deal between Russia and the United States, not focused on the Ukrainian ceasefire, Ukraine as just a piece of that, and probably not the first piece from the Kremlin's perspective. So clearly, I think at the very least, I can't imagine that Putin is going to suddenly accept these terms in the next 24 hours. I suspect he's going to want to get a meeting directly with Trump as soon as possible, face to face, where he can talk about, if I'm going to end this war and give you something you really want, not on my time frame, what are all of the other things that we could and should be doing together? And by the way, let's keep the Europeans out of that conversation. That's where I think Putin's head is right now.
Ian, if you can stand by for us as we are following this developing news, this breaking news. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying in Saudi Arabia the ball is now in Russia's court as U.S. and Ukrainian officials have come to an agreement on a 30-day ceasefire they're going to put before Russia. Let's go to Alex Marquardt. He's there in Saudi Arabia. Alex, we heard you ask that first question during the availability. I'm not sure you got a straightforward answer to your question, but just take us through what has happened there today. It's a big day.
It certainly is. And the expectation, the way that Rubio had framed it on the way in, was that this was going to be a listening session, that the U.S. side was going to be listening to the American side to eventually sort of come up with some positions that they could then take back to the Russians. This, Brianna, is a lot more concrete. This shows that not only is this U.S.-Ukraine relationship essentially back on track, but they are moving forward in tandem. One of the things that we thought would be discussed today was a Ukrainian proposal for a partial ceasefire. Instead, what we're learning now is essentially that the U.S. took that and ran with it. And they are now saying that this is a U.S. proposal not for a partial, but for a full ceasefire for at least 30 days immediately that could then be extended. So this goes well beyond what the Ukrainians were imagining and putting forward. And so when I asked Rubio for specifics, he made clear this isn't just about the end of aerial bombardment and the end of the fighting in the Black Sea that the Ukrainians talked about. He wants, the U.S. wants, all of the guns to fall silent. And he says that Ukrainians have agreed to this. And now it goes to the Russians at multiple levels, he says, because we know that that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, is going to be in Russia later this week. But this is going to be communicated, we're told, to the Russians at several levels. And if the Russians don't accept it, Rubio said, we will then know who the impediment to peace is. And of course, he's referring to the Russians there. The other big part of this is that military and intelligence assistance that had notably been paused, that severely damaged the Ukrainians in the wake of that disastrous White House meeting, that is now immediately being lifted, that pause. It will immediately go back into effect. We heard the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz saying it will go back to the normal stream of things, if you will, the Presidential Drawdown Authority, as it's known. So two major wins for the Ukrainians here, and the ball, Brianna, is now firmly in Russia's court.
Joining us now, European Union chief diplomat and former Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas. Really good to have you. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for braving New York City traffic. It can be hairy this time of day. First, your reaction to what Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced today?
I think it's positive. I was in contact with the Ukrainians as well, and they said it was very constructive meeting, very good discussions, and also the messages that come out are very good. And like the Secretary of State Rubio said, the ball is now in Russia's court.
What about security guarantees? It doesn't appear that there are any in this deal.
Well, right now is the question of ceasefire, whether, there is any kind of ceasefire that holds and that is a show of goodwill that the parties are willing to make steps in that direction. I think, it's the first step.
Do you expect goodwill from Russia?
I don't, but they are trying to play this game, showing that it's not them. But I think, this is really important to put the pressure on them because they can stop this war anytime. And I agree with, President Trump, who says that, the killing must stop. But the killing can't stop if the Russians just stop.
What are the conversations within the EU like regarding our sudden and very swift change in posture toward both Ukraine and the European Union and NATO?
Well, we definitely need to adapt to the new situation. We have been long-standing allies and friends with the United States, and of course we are in constant contact and trying to understand what is really going on and where this is all going. I think the messages that we get from Saudi Arabia today are actually very good ones. Also, the messages that the military aid and also the intelligence sharing is again, provided by Americans.
Can the EU, can NATO do this alone without the support of the United States?
Well, of course, we need to be in this together, and not only with the United States and European Union, but all the partners around the world who share the same principles. I was just in United Nations Security Council talking about the UN Charter that really sets out the principles. And why is it in place is that, countries wouldn't attack another country. And that's why it is important that all these countries around the world who respect those principles stick together and say it's not okay.
But you said in that speech that it's getting violated left and right, that aggression appears to be winning, that the people who signed on to this charter aren't abiding by this charter.
Yes, and that is a big problem. The international law is really under heavy fire. And the question for us is what we do about this. Are we, developing the international law further? And I think, there are several elements that are needed. For example, accountability. What happens if you really do breach the UN Charter? Has to be more automatic.
So what can you do? Because right now it seems that the UN Charter doesn't have any teeth to it.
It definitely needs more teeth in terms of reaction and accountability. But what can we do is to really stick together with those countries who still value those principles in the UN Charter and do the things that we can do, put the pressure on those who violate the treaty by, sanctions, by political pressure, by economical pressure, the tools that we have in our hands.
The UK has said it will be willing to add peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Anybody else within the EU willing to do that as well?
Well, first, there has to be peace so that there can also be peacekeeping. And the discussions are ongoing by different countries.
I want to bring in Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania. Again, this breaking news, Congressman, that there has been, at least on the Ukrainians' part, an agreement for a 30-day ceasefire. Now we see where this goes with the Russians. Your reaction, and do you trust Vladimir Putin if a deal can be made for at least 30 days?
Do I trust the former KGB chief based in East Germany when the Cold War ended? Although for Vladimir Putin, the Cold War never ended, and he has worked over the last several decades to attempt to reconstitute the old Soviet empire. That's a long way of saying no, I don't trust Vladimir Putin. Doviai no proviai, trust but verify, is the old Russian maxim that Ronald Reagan used to quote, and I think is apt here.
So does this, Congressman, though, get us anywhere?
Well, it remains to be seen. Let's not forget, Ukraine was observing a ceasefire in 2020 when they saw the bulk of their country invaded by Vladimir Putin. If the Russians stopped fighting tomorrow, there would be no war. If the Ukrainians stop fighting, there'll be no Ukraine. So it has always been up to Vladimir Putin and Russia to end this war. I'm glad that Ukraine will abide by a 30-day ceasefire, but frankly, that's not the more difficult party to get to agree to a ceasefire.
So it looks like Zelensky finally exposed Trump, because this deal, and look, we have to wait for the terms of it, but it seems like Trump didn't want to make any kind of deal at all. It seems like the plan, now this is my speculation, after that disaster White House meeting a couple weekends ago now, was that Trump just wanted to let Russia conquer the entirety of Ukraine. That's what it seemed like was happening. I mean, after that, Russia launched a new wave of offensives and whatnot. And now we see a ceasefire. And there's going to be a whole lot of debate about what's in it, what isn't, how friendly is it to Russia. But the thing is, it looked like before that meeting or during that meeting, Trump and Vance and all the rest were willing to sell out Ukraine entirely. And I think due to international pressure and the ability of Zelensky to win the hearts and minds of world leaders and regular Americans, including many Republican voters, that things are looking a little bit better. This is not the time to fully celebrate, but I do think Zelensky has scored a bit of a coup against Donald Trump, and that's impressive to see. It's a difficult position to be in, and he may ultimately have to accept terms of deals that will be unpopular in Ukraine and that will reward the jerk dictator Putin. But it doesn't seem like the victory the far-right MAGA wanted, and that's a blow to Trump.